period. And if you've got something that has had that degree of R&D, then it makes sense to me to make use of that. And to make things even better, all the faulty products have been withdrawn from the marketplace, so that what remains are some pretty damn good bits of R&D. This is one example. This is a beetle that lays its eggs in freshly burnt wood. It can detect a forest fire at 80 kilometers away. And if you compare that to a man-made fire detector there, which has a range of about 8 meters, that little creature has a range that's 10,000 times as sensitive. And it doesn't need a continuous copper connection back to a power station burning fossil fuels. And if you're designing for a fairly extreme environment like a desert, one way of applying biomimicry is to look at some of the organisms that have adapted to that environment. And there are actually some pretty damn good ones. This is the sand skink, also called the sand fish. And in many ways it's got more in common with a fish. It can swim in sand. If it gets too hot during the day, it swims down into the sand to where it's cooler. And its skin has a molecular level of sugar molecules that make it virtually abrasion-proof. It's more slip-resistant and more abrasion-proof than polished stainless steel. Here's another pretty amazing one. This is the thorny devil, which drinks with its feet. It's got a network of capillary grooves on its skin, so that if it's standing on damp ground, it can actually absorb water through capillary action, which tracks up to its mouth. It then licks its lips and looks rather pleased with itself. Another fantastically well adapted species is the camel. I think the camel actually deserves a bit more respect. There are a lot of curses in Arabic that are based on the camel, but in terms of its adaptation to desert environments, it's absolutely amazing. Its nostrils are a miracle of water recovery engineering. So as it breathes in, its nostrils hydrate that really dry air, so it's less of a shock to the system. And then as it breathes out, its nostrils recapture nearly all that moisture. And the tiny amount of moisture that is lost, it uses for evaporative cooling, so that it's able to keep its brain about 6 degrees centigrade cooler than the rest of its body. So that's absolutely critical for getting to the next watering hole. And here's a plant that's pretty amazing. This plant, the resurrection plant, can completely dry out and survive in a state of suspended animation for decades or more. When the rain comes, in a matter of hours, it turns back into this photosynthetically active plant. So those are all pretty accomplished, but the hero for me is the Namibian fog basking beetle. It's hard to find a better example of biomimicry than this. This creature has evolved a way of harvesting its own fresh water in the Namibian desert. And the way that it does that is that at night it comes out of its hiding place, and because it's got a matte black shell, it's able to radiate heat out to the night sky and become just slightly cooler than its surroundings. So when the moist breeze blows in off the sea, you get these little droplets of water forming on the beetle's shell. And just before the sun comes up, it tips its shell up, the water runs down to its mouth, it has a good drink, and then goes up and hides for the rest of the day. I think it's fair to say it's not a great quality of life, but it is a clever trick. And the ingenuity, if you could call it that, goes even further, because you can probably just make out these little bumps on the beetle's shell. Now those are hydrophilic, they attract water. And between them there's a waxy finish which repels water. So as the droplets of water form on those bumps, they stay in very tight droplet form, which means that they're much more mobile than they would be if it was just a film of water over the core shell. So even when there's only a tiny amount of water in the atmosphere, it's still able to harvest that very efficiently and conduct it down to its mouth. And that creature has been the source of inspiration for the scheme I'm about to show you, the Sahara Forest Project. I just want to zoom out again for a second. This is an animation showing global photosynthetic activity over the course of a number of years. And what you can see, I'll just run that again. What you can see is that at the boundaries of some of these deserts, the boundary of what is photosynthetically active actually migrates north and south according to the seasons. So there's a question that we put to ourselves, which is that is there a way that we could intervene in a small way at those boundary conditions to reverse the process of desertification, using the fog basking beetle as a source of inspiration? And it's in many ways it all starts with this scheme, which is the seawater greenhouse, I'm working with Charlie Payton, who invented this. And this is a wonderfully elegant bit of sustainable design. It's a greenhouse designed for coastal arid regions. And the way that it works is that on the seaward side, you have a whole wall of evaporator grills. And you trickle seawater over those, so that as the onshore breeze blows through it, it picks up a lot of moisture and is cooled in the process. So that means that inside you've got a cool, humid growing environment. Much better growing environment for crops in arid regions. And then at the downwind end, there's a whole series of condenser grills which are exactly like the fog basking beetle. And that recaptures a lot of that humidity, turning it into distilled water. So that building is able to turn seawater into distilled water just using the sun and the wind and a tiny amount of pumping energy. And the thing that was really remarkable about the first one that was built was that it was actually creating more water than it needed for the plants inside to grow. And because this was nowhere near a town, they weren't too sure what to do with it, so they just started spreading it on the land around. And it transformed the landscape. So just between the time that it took between this photograph, completion, and 1 year later, that's how the site looked. So it became like a green ink blot on a piece of blotting paper, spreading out from the building, turning barren land back into biologically productive land. And in that sense, I would argue that it goes beyond sustainable design to achieve restorative design. So that was one of the things that we were very keen to scale up. And we know from the 3 versions of the seawater greenhouse that have been built, we know very accurately how well they work. So we know, for instance, that they evaporate about 50 tons of seawater per hectare per day. So if we were to scale it up to something on this sort of size, that's 20,000 hectares of greenhouses in southern Spain. It's an agricultural nightmare based on groundwater. It's all built using very cheap plastic. So it produces thousands of tons of plastic waste every year. And they're extracting the groundwater at such a rate that it's starting to turn saline. So the Spanish government has now decided to build a whole series of fossil fuel desalination plants around the coast. If that was seawater greenhouses, that region would be a net producer of fresh water. Never mind. If we think about that area, 20,000 hectares, times 50 tons of seawater evaporated per hectare per day, a scheme of that size would be evaporating 1 million tons of seawater per day. And clearly with volumes of water like that, ideally we wouldn't want to have to pump it. So we've identified a number of places that are on land but below sea level. And there are a surprising number of these around, some of them quite deep, like the Qattara Depression in Egypt, 133 meters below sea level. So if we could find some of these that allow us to get a sea pipe to them, then in theory we could bring in unlimited quantities of seawater just under gravity. When we think about nature, we often think about it as being all about competition. And certainly competition is important, but it's not anywhere near as significant as scientists once thought. And if you look at mature ecosystems, you're just as likely to find really striking examples of symbiotic relationships in which 2 or more organisms have evolved to hook up for mutual benefit. So we applied the same biomimetic principle to this scheme. We looked around for other technologies that could work in a symbiotic way with the seawater greenhouse. And the one that we settled on was concentrated solar power. This is based on the principle of using solar tracking mirrors to focus the sun's energy onto a point, to turn water to steam, to drive turbines to create electricity. And it turned out this had some very interesting synergies with the seawater greenhouse. They both work very well in exactly the same parts of the world. Hot, sunny deserts are ideal. Concentrated solar power needs a supply of demineralized fresh water. And that's exactly what the seawater greenhouse produces. CSP also produces a lot of waste heat. We could make use of that waste heat in the seawater greenhouses to evaporate more seawater and create more fresh water. And just to give you some idea of the potential of concentrated solar power, that square of the Sahara Desert, 263 kilometers by 263 kilometers, if that was all concentrated solar powers, that would provide enough electricity to meet all the world's electricity needs. Now, I was skeptical about that when I first read it, so I did my own calculation. I looked up the surface area of the